Okay, everybody, in this slideshow, we're going to talk about civil rights and give us a little bit of information about different groups. So let's go ahead and take a look. So when we talk about civil rights and civil rights organizations, there's still an elite attached to that. Here, established elites may, pass things to have kind of a symbolic gesture to pacify people that are upset about something. They bring protest leaders into the system. This is more or less their preferred method of action. They also limit protests through repression. That's been common in the past. So challengers are members of these disempowered groups, and they can't fully enter the system. There's also bargainers, and they offer kind of goodwill and willingness to become part of the system. So we look at minorities acquiring elite status. Let's look at 2022 demographics. So since we've had an African American president, an African American attorney general in Eric Holder, African American Secretary of State Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice. Governors, we have two African American Supreme Court justices now, Clarence Thomas and Ketanji Brown Jackson. We have a woman currently serving as Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. Women had been former Secretary of States. We mentioned Condoleezza Rice and also Hillary Clinton, Madeleine Albright. We have a Latinx person on the Supreme Court, an African American woman on the Supreme Court. And if we look at the demographics here, we have 124 women in the House, 24 in the Senate, 58 African Americans serving in the House, 3 in the Senate. 44 Latinx serving in the House, 7 in the Senate, 15 Asian American Pacific Islanders in the House and 2 in the Senate, and 5 natives in the House. If you look at this link, it'll give you demographic information. Well, I'll fix that. But should you give you demographic information about the breakdown of the court, of the Congress by demographic groups. And this is just the world population, shows how many people are in the United States. Currently, I believe there's 325 million per the last census. So if we look at different groups here, and the history of exclusion, African Americans had to overcome slavery, segregation, Jim Crow laws, and other civil rights limitations. Latinx people have been denied citizenship and had their immigration restricted. Asian American Pacific Islanders have suffered exclusionary laws, just like in World War II, legal discrimination, and were denied basic democratic rights. So, when we have the Declaration of Independence and that whole creed that this country was founded on, that all men are created equal, it kind of creates what we call the American dilemma. All men were created equal unless you were African American. You were then considered 3/5 of a person, and that didn't necessarily give you citizenship. Remember, that only gave you the ability to be counted toward the census for the purposes of appropriating representation in your area. Remember, the House of Representatives, all the representatives are counted, all the people are counted, and there's 435 representatives. We're counted by the census, and then our country is carved up into 435 different districts. But at the time of the founding of the country, as well as the writing of the Constitution, slaves were only counted as 3/5 of a person for representational purposes only. So we've had struggles to freedom for African Americans. There's the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery and involuntary servitude. The 14th Amendment required that every state practice equal protection of the law. The 15th Amendment prohibited states and federal and state governments from abridging the right to vote on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And the Civil Rights Act of 1875 outlawed segregation by private businesses. And we'll talk more about some of these in a little bit. we've had court cases that have uh, restricted African American rights. One of the ones that stands out is Plessy versus Ferguson, which upheld state laws requiring segregation so as long as facilities were separate but equal. And as we know, during kind of looking back at history, um, these facilities were not equal. And then we had a pattern of violent repression at the turn of the century, lynching. I mean, just last year, I believe lynching was made a federal crime. It only took them, what, a couple of 100 years to do that. So definitely acts of repression. We've had groups that come out of the African American struggle for freedom. Groups like the NAACP and the Urban League, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and the National Urban League. They sought to help create change through court action and other legal means. The NAACP is the oldest, obviously, but they're still pretty active. Executive Order 9981 desegregated the military. And then we had Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, which struck down this Plessy versus Ferguson law, where they said you cannot segregate based on race. This was a landmark decision in which the Supreme Court ruled that state laws establishing racial segregation in public schools are unconstitutional, even if the segregated schools are otherwise equal in quality, but we kind of understand throughout history that they weren't. Jim Crow laws were in effect. Jim Crow has been kind of a derogatory term for a Black man, making it a fitting name for the laws that were enforced in the South and some border states from 1877 through the 1960s. Even though we still had these court cases come out trying to enfranchise African Americans, there were still laws that are kind of tacit laws that were out there that were illegal, but the county sheriffs, mayors, and state governors were not enforcing the law properly. A lot of these Jim Crow laws were placed to maintain racial segregation after the Civil War ended, and it also maintained racial segregation after Brown versus Board of Education. Initially, Jim Crow laws required separations of white people and people of color on all forms of public transportation and in schools. And this still happened even after the Brown decision. Eventually, segregation expanded to include interaction and commingling in schools, cemeteries, parks, movie theaters, restaurants. And, they even had something called the one drop rule. So if you were suspected of having a Black ancestor, even just one in the very distant past, you were considered a person of color, and then you were subject to Jim Crow laws. So you can kind of see the ridiculousness in the thinking now here. So one way that desegregation was accomplished, it was accomplished by military force. And there's a couple examples on the slide here. Eisenhower used military force in 1957 to enforce a federal court order to desegregate a high school in Little Rock, Arkansas. President Kennedy used federal troops to enforce desegregation at the University of Mississippi. And this was all done with the help of military force. It was simple that local sheriffs and governors were simply not enforcing the law. Rosa Parks' refusal to move to the back of the bus helped spur the Martin Luther King Jr. movement, nonviolent, breaking unjust laws in the open, a form of civil disobedience, bearing witness, and a willingness to accept the penalty help emphasize injustices. And I think one of the things that really helped Martin Luther King was this nonviolent protest, because if I think he kind of took the Malcolm X way, it might have scared off some of the moderate whites that actually helped in the civil rights movement. Remember, it wasn't just African Americans. They did a big thing. They did a lot of work, but also they had people that came down from the north that helped, white people that came down from the north that helped as well. So Latinx American search for rights, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ended the Mexican American Civil War and also ceded a large number of land to the United States, present day California, New Mexico, Texas, Wyoming, all the way up to Wyoming. U.S. acquired territories like Puerto Rico in 1898 through the Spanish-American War. Immigration from Mexico was fairly open into the 1920s, and it was eventually shut off. After World War II, the U.S. introduced the Brazil guest labor program, which imported Mexican laborers into the United States to work in the fields and do manual labor, and this lasted until 1964. LULAC is kind of the Latinx version of the NAACP. One of the interesting cases that people don't really know about is Mendez versus Westminster School District. Now, this was not a Supreme Court case. This only made it up to the district courts. So let's take a look at it. Plaintiffs claimed that their children, along with 5,000 other children of Mexican ancestry, were victims of unconstitutional discrimination by being forced to attend separate schools for Mexicans in Westminster, Garden Grove, Santa Ana, and the El Modena school districts of Orange County, which is really kind of, it's interesting because that is what, like maybe 90 miles away from San Diego. So really close. Admission was based on skin tone and surname. So if I was a kid at that time, I have an Anglo surname, but if I was looked at, I have a darker skin, I would have been put in the Mexican school. This didn't make it to the Supreme Court. It made it to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. And the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals basically ruled that the segregation was not racially based. But since the school district didn't have permission to do what they were doing, it was impermissible. So basically they were saying, well, they weren't doing it based on race, but we didn't know they were going to do this and we didn't give them permission, so they can't do it. Asian American Pacific Islanders social rights. Asian Americans were prevented by law from becoming citizens, and for long periods were denied entry into the U.S. Citizenship was only made for free white people, and we also had the Chinese Exclusion Act, which made Chinese immigrants ineligible for citizenship, and this was repealed in 1943. One thing that we also kind of focus on is the internment of Japanese Americans after World War II. Executive Order 9066 by FDR segregated and interned Japanese Americans, even Japanese Americans who were citizens here for generations, into internment camps. They lost a lot of money. And as we saw in the court case, Karamatsu versus the United States, they weren't really given any recourse or any reparations because of that. There's also been a multi-race kind of movement too. The one-drop rule, like we mentioned earlier, a lot of people are a mixed ethnicity. And I think the reason that we have this demographic group growing is it's not as taboo to marry outside your race as it used to be. I'm a product of an interracial marriage. The one-drop rule, right? So in 1967, in the case of Loving versus Virginia, that court decision struck down laws banning interracial marriage, causing an increase in the number of persons from multiple race backgrounds. And there was an association of multi-ethnic Americans was formed in 1988. And in 2000, people of mixed race were able to check more than one box for race in the census. There's also been a Native American movement. And this is a really quiet one that some people don't hear about. In 1924, the federal government officially classified American Indians as citizens. Now think about that, 1924, less than 100 years ago. This was done after natives had fought in 3 wars for the United States. Many tribes that live on reservations are currently facing destructions of surrounding environments and water sources, depressed economy, lots of violence against women, drug and alcohol crisis. So not every tribe has a casino. So there's still a lot of poverty in this demographic group. The Indian Civil Rights Act of 1968 applies to Indian tribes of the U.S. and makes many of them, but not all of them, guarantees of the Bill of Rights applicable within the tribe. Prior to that, the Supreme Court stated the tribal members were not subject to constitutional protections because they lived on reservations, that were kind of not a part of the United States. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, the U.S. government attempted to control travel of natives off of native reservations. Since natives did not obtain citizenship until 1924, they were considered wards of the state and were denied various basic rights, including the right to travel. So again, you could probably see that's a 14th Amendment right violation. One of the interesting occurrences in the native struggle is the occupation of Alcatraz. Alcatraz is occupied by 89 natives and supporters led by Richard Oakes and Lanata Means and others. This occupation lasted for 19 months from November 1969 to June of 1971. And it was forcibly ended by the U.S. government. And if you've ever been to Alcatraz, you can see there's like graffiti on it that refers to natives. I think when you drive up on the ferry, you could see it when you go and dock. This lasted for 18 months. Oakes' 13-year-old daughter fell from her death in an accident. And again, if you've ever been to Alcatraz, you know there's a lot of rocky parts and it's an island, right? So, it's not really safe. So the Oakes family had actually lost their heart in the protest, so they decided to stop. And it did spark some sympathy among other Americans and among the American public. The Dakota Access Pipeline protest was something that happened in 2016, which was in reaction to the approved construction of a pipeline through native land. The pipeline would have ran from North Dakota to Illinois. The Standing Rock tribe considered the pipeline and its intended crossing of the Missouri River to constitute a threat to the region's clean water and to its ancient burial ground. So it was going across sacred land. Bulldozers were used to raise off that land, and protesters entered the area. Security workers used attack dogs, which bit at least 6 protesters. And also, I think at the time, kind of going down toward when the winter came, they would turn the hoses on the protesters in like 19, 20-degree weather. So, that water goes up and it comes down as sheets of ice. The Obama administration had ordered the Army Corps of Engineers to find the solution to the problem, and construction was stopped. After Trump was elected, he ordered the project to restart. When Biden was elected, he stopped the project. But one thing that you kind of need to understand about this is that pipeline did leak into the native water supply. So the natives in Standing Rock were actually right. There was also an attempt to limit the ability for some natives to vote, especially in North Dakota. They had a law that required a person to have some type of social identification with a street address, a physical street address. They made this law about 3 weeks before the 2018 midterm election. It required them to have a formal street address. On reservations, there's no addresses. A lot of Native Americans will use P.O. boxes to get their mail, so there was no street addresses. Natives were victorious as they claim they can present their tribal ID to vote. So another thing that it's kind of been in the news lately are Native Hawaiians. Native Hawaiians still face higher levels of poverty, homelessness, domestic violence, incarceration, ill health, lower levels of income and education than the general U.S. population. A lot have been kind of trying to discourage people from the mainland from buying property, and they have been buying property, and it kind of has driven the price up. So people who are Native Hawaiian cannot afford some of the prices of homes in Hawaii. There's also, kind of criticisms of disrespectful tourists. I've seen news stories about, people getting into car accidents where they're trying to take, these pictures and they're not paying attention. There is also a kind of a protest at Mauna Kea, which is the site of a 30-meter telescope. This is the most sacred dormant volcano in the Hawaiian region. Protests against the telescope involve people like Jason Momoa, The Rock, Bruno Mars, Leigh McFarland, who is a mixed martial artist, and Max Holloway, who is also a mixed martial artist. Eventually, there's going to be a removal of the telescope to be completed next year. And here's just some pictures of it. This is the picture from the volcano, and then here's Jason Momoa protesting on the right. So we also had the Civil Rights Act of '64 that put an end to a lot of these Jim Crow laws. Title VII prohibited unlawful. It was unlawful to discriminate or segregate persons on the basis of race, color, religion, national origin. And in the past few years, they've added the LGBTQIA community to that as well. So it's kind of, when we talk about racial inequality, the topic of affirmative action comes up. And it's a really, it's a weird thing to talk about, and something that is I don't know if there's a good solution to it. So, when we started this class, we talked about the equality of outcome. And this is going to be against the equality of opportunity, right? We talked both about this the class at the beginning of class. I said we're going to kind of revisit this at the end. So equality of opportunity says that we have the ability to be whatever we want to be in life. And it's the government's responsibility to ensure that we have the ability to be whatever we want. Now, equality of outcomes is a little bit different. This is where we have kind of the equal sharing of the wealth, income, jobs, and material rewards. So it's one of those things that I don't know if we can find common ground on. And we have the question of affirmative action. Does affirmative action kind of result in reverse racism? So there's a court case out there called Regents of the University of California versus Bake. So Alan Bake was a 35-year-old white man who had applied for admission to the University of California Medical School at Davis twice, and he was rejected both times. The school had reserved 16 places in each class for 100 for qualified minorities as part of the university's affirmative action program. Bake's qualifications, his GPA and test scores, exceeded those of the minority students when in the 2 years that Bake's application was rejected. So you could probably see Bake was probably maybe number 85 on, but since they had those 16 places for minorities, he wasn't able to gain admission. Did this violate his 14th Amendment right in the Civil Rights Act by practicing an affirmative action policy that repeated rejection of Bake's application? What was found, though, was a little bit interesting. So 4 justices contended that any racial quota system supported by the government violated the Civil Rights Act. But kind of what they said was, you can't have rigid quotas in the use of admissions. Now, you can have diversity goals, but you can't set aside these places using a specific number as a reservation for minority students. So there's a little bit of interesting argument there, and that violated his 14th Amendment right, those racial quotas. So just, affirmative action is one of those interesting things. We could see by these 2 points that people probably didn't understand the question because they're basically the same thing. There is a court case that is happening right now where a group of Asian Americans are suing Harvard with regards to their admission practices, the Students for Fair Admission. They claim that Harvard imposes a soft racial quota, which keeps the numbers of Asian Americans artificially low. And the plaintiffs argue that Asian Americans scored higher than any of the applicants, but they do not get admitted because their personal ratings are dragging down their admission chances. Allison Burrow, who's a judge, ruled that Harvard's admission policies do not unduly discriminate against Asian Americans. The case is to be heard in the Supreme Court in the near future, and it was consolidated with another case out of the University of North Carolina. Justice Brown Jackson will have to recuse herself because she sits on the Harvard board. So just like California, we had the Civil Rights Initiative. We've talked about that. Now we have women's movements, anti-slavery movements. After the Civil War, a lot of arguments were focused on property rights of married women and protection in the workplace and in families. The women's movement helped spurn prohibition, where men were going out, getting drunk, cheating on their wives, coming home, hitting their wives, visiting prostitutes. So it led to the prohibition, and also we saw women's suffrage happen, where in 1919, the 19th Amendment was passed to guarantee women the right to vote. And there's been classes or different types of systems of feminism. Equity feminism is, remains the vision of the vast majority of women in the United States. There's kind of a reluctance to identify with the term feminism because sometimes it comes across as kind of a pejorative term. And equal treatment of women and men without challenging inequalities perpetrated by employers, educational and religious institutions, and other elements of society. So this is more of the mainstream type of feminism. Now, there's also gender feminism, which was kind of the second wave of feminism that happened in the 60s and 70s. Radical feminism seeks revolutionary restructuring of virtually all social institutions. Radical feminists will say that society is patriarchy. In a patriarchy, men have more social power than women, and they harm women by oppressing them. There's also liberal feminism, and this focuses on socialization of children into gender roles and seeks reforms of these measures. It's defined by its focus on achieving gender equality through political and legal reform within the framework of a liberal democracy. And there's also postmodern feminism, which is a mix of post-structuralism, postmodernism, and French feminism. The goal of this is to destabilize that patriarchal norm that's entrenched in our society and have that lead to gender equality. Women are in the workforce. Modern feminism is driven by the changing role of women in the workforce. 70% of women are in the workforce. There's primarily two reasons why women are capable, and also you need two incomes now due to the cost of living. Men still dominate white-collar occupations, and overall women continue to earn substantially less than men. Title IX, which is, been in the news a lot lately with regards to some of these actions that have happened at universities with regards to sexual assault. Title IX of the Education Act Amendment of 1972 bars discrimination in housing, admissions, rules, financial aid, faculty, staff recruitment and pay, and athletics. And we usually hear it with athletics too, because a lot of colleges have to fund women's sports as well. And there's also Title IX violations if there's some type of sexual assault on campus. A lot of universities will have a Title IX coordinator to come in and step in to investigate if there's any violations of the Education Act. So just a little bit more about the gender gap. You could see where women are paid less than men, and especially Latinx women are paid less than men. We also have LGBTQIA rights, right? One of the first issues was recognition of gays as legitimate members of society. A lot of anti-gay thought came out of religious stances, and it was incorporated into secular law. For example, homosexual intercourse remained illegal in parts of the U.S. until 2003. And it's interesting, in 1974, which is only less than 50 years ago, the APA, the American Psychiatric Association, removed homosexuality from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorder, declaring it's a normal form of human sexuality and it's not a deviant sex issue. So we've had instances that have occurred with regards to the LGBTQIA movement. The Stonewall riots in 1969, where the NYPD went into a gay club and started violence. 1977, the election of openly gay Harvey Milk to the San Francisco Board of Supervisors is interesting. He was actually killed by a fellow supervisor by the name of Dan White. And Dan White used the argument that he killed Harvey Milk because he was not of sound mind because of a Twinkie that he ate. It's a famous Twinkie defense. Matthew Shepard Act of 2009 made violence against the LGBT community a hate crime federally. Matthew Shepard was a young man who met three people at a bar, and I guess they thought there was going to be some type of sexual action happening, and they actually impaled him on a fence in Wyoming. Gay rights organizations have made same-sex marriage their main goal. And in the 1996 Defense of Marriage Act was repealed by court actions. And in 2015, same-sex marriage was legalized across the U.S. And right now they're trying to codify that in the Senate to make same-sex marriage a federal right. Because with this Dobbs decision, it's hypothetical that some decisions might be made that states could conceivably reject same-sex marriage now. So that's what I got. Civil rights. Thank you for listening.